good to go. I'm getting the thumbs up from people outside. I gotta stay on this, right? I don't have a roaming microphone. All right, no problem. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. This is the Chronicles of Elyria deep dive design discussion. I know many of you have stopped by the booth the last couple of days, and so some of this will be a review, but hopefully we go a lot deeper than what you guys have heard from before. Just so you guys know, I'm going to start a little bit just about Soulbound Studios. I know that's what you guys are not here to hear about. You'd like to hear about the game, so I'll go over that pretty quickly. My name is Jeromy Walsh. I'm the owner and creative director of Soulbound Studios. I've got a couple of my staff members here as well. As it says, I've been in the game industry now for about 15 to 20 years, and I've been an active storyteller across multiple pen and paper RPG systems. That's important because while I've been a software engineer for the majority of my career, having an interest in ideas about design of a game from a pen and paper and mechanics standpoint, as well as from a psychology standpoint, which is where I spent a lot of my research in college on learning theory, behavior modification, personality theory. These all come together to create an experience where you've got a head of a studio who's both an engineer and a designer, which means that, most importantly, when I tell my designers, you need to do this, it's because I know it's possible and I know it's not possible, at least yet. So let me go ahead and move on. So in terms of our studio, we've actually been around now for about 2 years. We were at PAX last year for the same convention. You know, we've seen a lot of repeat people up here in the front. We were here last year. We've got some of our champions from last year's combat competition. We are a small studio. We're an indie studio with about 21 people now. About 2 years ago, we started and have now done a successful Kickstarter, yay for us, and we're working very hard as a small studio to bring this game to you guys. So it's important for all those that walk out of here with an interest in the game to get engaged in the community, let people know what you think about the game, because this is really, it's a grassroots type game, right? We need as many people interested about changing the industry as we can, and Chronicles of Elyria really is about changing and redefining the MMORPG space. You know, isn't it about time? Anybody agree? It's about time for some freshness in the industry. All right. So we built Chronicles of Elyria, the studio, Soulbound Studios, for the single purpose of trying to solve many of the problems in the MMO space. And you can see here we've got a quote that it's kind of one of my mantras. There's a quote by Einstein which says that if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution. And that's kind of what Soulbound Studios is all about. It's spending a long time thinking about the MMORPG space and then spending a concerted effort towards the end of that journey on actually delivering the solution to you guys. So the design of Chronicles of Elyria has actually been in progress for about 15 years now. As far as I know, it's the longest in-design game in history. But now we're at that time where we're actually moved out of the process of thinking about the problems and are more about thinking about the solutions. So we have taken a problem-specific approach though. We've thought about, over the last 15 years, the problems that we're seeing in the MMO space, and then identified the smallest number of features and feature areas necessary to solve those in a cohesive, intelligent way. So one of the things I want to do is real quick, I'm going to list up here some of the problems that we have in the MMORPG space right now. And you're probably thinking to yourself right now what those are. And I'm not going to quiz you or anything like that, but be thinking about the things that you don't like about MMORPGs. And let's see if I capture your specific complaint in this following list. Let's see. All right, so we're ultimately going to talk through all of these, but first I wanted to just kind of go over them at the high level. So the first one we have up there is the grind and the level cap, right? You guys have all seen that one before. Quest hubs and railroading, that's probably a couple of your guys's. The meaningless existence, that's one of my personal favorites, or least favorites, depending on how you look at it. The barrier to entry, anybody out here ever played EVE Online? You know what I'm talking about. All right, best in class, slot homogeneity, that idea that at some point everybody becomes kind of the same around level cap. The single player MMO and the one-man economy. How many of you have played an MMO before and felt like you were the only one in the world? And we're not talking about population of servers, it doesn't matter whether or not you're really playing with other players or not. And then the community-centric development. That was one we added at the last minute. We'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end of this. So let's talk about them all in greater detail. So the grind and the level cap. One of the big problems that exist in the MMORPG space today is the focus is always on the end game. You hear that talked about a lot. What's the end game experience for your game? Well, if you have an end game experience, then by definition, there's a part that comes before the end game. And if the end game is really what the game is about, if that's what the play experience is designed for, if that's where the designers are spending most of their concerted effort, it means you get an inferior experience for the process up to the end game. It's kind of our philosophy that it shouldn't be about the end game, it should be about the whole game. So we don't have an end game per se. That's not to be confused with the game not being enjoyable throughout. It's actually the opposite. We've made a concerted effort to make sure that from the moment you sign in until the moment you felt like you achieved all of your personal goals in the game, that the entire process feels like it's part of that end game. Quest hubs and railroading. We're going to talk about that one kind of in greater depth later on. Each of these we're going to dive into as we talk about our solutions. But quest hubs and railroading is this idea that you'd start the game and you move on from location to location, and everybody goes through this same funnel. It's a process of moving everyone through. You see it mostly in theme park-based games where they've got a very strong narrative, and that's great. We like the fact that it's a strong narrative and that it gives an opportunity to enjoy a story. But we've been so conditioned to move from quest hub at this point that we rarely even read what the story is about. Let's be honest. We're just looking for the exclamation marks. We're looking for the points on the mini-map so we know how to get on to the next quest hub, so that we can get to the end game, right? The next one, like I said before, is one of my personal favorites, which is the meaningless experience. Each day, I can't even remember what, I can figure out what each of the images are on these. The meaningless experience. This is one that's important to me because I value my time a lot. And I'm sure that most of you do as well. And so one of the problems that I've encountered in the last several generations of MMOs is you sign on, you spend a concerted amount of time of your effort and energy to try and get enjoyment out of the game, only you realize that the enjoyment you're getting is the extent of the value. You're actually not contributing anything to the world itself. In fact, I once signed out of an MMO, came back 6 months later, was standing in the exact same place, talking to the exact same NPC, and honestly the world didn't care whether I was there or not. I get up every day, I go to work, not just because I want revenue, but because I want to contribute to society. I want to have an impact on the world around me. I think most of you are the same. So what if we had a game where everything you did mattered? You had some impact. There was meaning to your time beyond just the amount of enjoyment you got from being in that world. What if the world actually missed your presence in its world? Next one is the barrier to entry. This one's typically seen in two forms. So the first form is the one that you guys are probably most interested in, which is the one that you see up there, which is that several games have an advancement system that's based on time. And so when enough time surpasses that you can't actually get competitive anymore, it feels like there's no reason to join. There's an image up here, one of the classic examples of EVE Online. EVE Online is a great game now as it was then, but the play experience is different. You need to be a part of an organization, you need to be part of a group, because the single player experience at this point in time is really difficult to become competitive in. But there's another form of the barrier to entry, and this is one that's typically seen in rating games, which is you come into a game after an expansion is just released. Right? You guys know what I'm talking about. There's a lot of games that have regular expansions. The expansion is just released. You weren't able to get in there at the beginning. By the time you join the expansion, most people are done with the lower level dungeons that are necessary to get to that end game content again, and so now there's nobody available for you to play with for those kind of ramp up dungeons and things like that. So you're disincentivized to actually go through those group activities in a single player mode, or you get people who have done it so many times they're bored of it, and they're not experiencing it and learning it at the same time that you are. And so timing is extremely important in those cases. Best-in-class slot homogeneity. This is another one that's been around for over a decade. This idea that you're encouraged to do things your way, to be your character, to play your class how you want it to be played, only to reach some point in time where there is no your way anymore. There is only the best way. And at that point, your ability to define the role that you want to be, whether or not it's a crafter or a warrior or a champion or a healer or whatever, it's no longer really about the roles that you play. It's really just about what slot you fill inside of a dungeon or raid. And if you're not optimally built, you're less valuable than the person next to you. And we want to be valued more than just the equipment we have on us, right? We want to be valued by what kind of player we are, what kind of thing we bring to the world beyond just what kind of role we can fill inside of a raid. The single-player MMO and the one-man economy. This is another one that's important. We talk about massively multiplayer games as massively multiplayer, but the reality is, in most cases, they're single-player games or small group-based games in a massively multiplayer chat environment. A lot of that has to do with technical limitations, but a lot of it doesn't. A lot of it just has to do with our inability to think outside of the box on how we get a large number of players interacting and working together. I talk about the one-man economy on that. So I like to give a little story. We'll talk about it more, but right now the one-man economy is this idea that if you want to be a warrior character in a typical game, you want to be competitive because there is this slot homogeneity, you need the best in slot, you have to craft it. But that means you probably need to be something like a blacksmith as well, because you need that weapon. But if you need to be able to blacksmith it, you also need resources, so you probably need to be a miner. And so this kind of idea that you have to become a one-man economy in order to achieve your goals is something that we would like to get away from, because there's a lot of people, probably in this audience, who don't want to be combatants. They'd like to just be crafters, but a lot of games actually force this idea that you must be an adventurer to also be a crafter, and vice versa. So we want to get beyond that. So just as a quick show of hands, and I suspect it's going to be easier to do it this way. Raise your hand if I did not name one of the real problems that you have with MMORPGs today. Got one. All right, I'll have to talk to you afterwards, because maybe I need to rethink this design. I'm just kidding. All right. You agree? Okay. So this kind of shows you, these are problems that we all know. We've all experienced in massively multiplayer online role-playing games, but it's a problem, or a set of problems that we haven't actually solved before until Chronicles of Elyria. So Chronicles of Elyria, I took those problems over the last 15 years and I distilled them down into kind of 3 core values. These 3 core values, we felt like if we could solve these things, if we could make these things a reality, that we would be able to solve all the problems that we previously discussed about. And just kind of like signpost a little bit for you today, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you what the high-level principles are, and then I'm going to show you the design pillars that came out of those 3 things, and then we're going to deep dive into some of the features and feature areas of Chronicles of Elyria so you can get a real idea about how this is different and how we solve those problems that we just talked about. Alright, so this is here, I'll go into more depth on them, but there's a truly persistent world, the human condition, and emergent storytelling. So the first is a truly persistent world. When I talk about a truly persistent world, I'm talking about a world where everything that you do matters. I'm talking about the material world. So you craft an object, you drag it out of your inventory. It doesn't just magically disappear into the ether. That's a real object in the world. It was created by your sweat and blood and tears. And if you leave it on the ground, it's going to stay there. It might rust and decay, but it will stay there, right? Somebody can come along later on and pick it up. You can pick it up and break it back down into its components. You can re-smelt it into the crafting materials that it came from. But the idea is that this is not a digital entity that exists only in the ether. It's a physical object that exists in the world and remains in the world until somebody changes that state. But we're not talking about objects alone. We're talking about persistence of memory. You talk to an NPC, you interact with them, you engage with them, they're going to remember that conversation. Your family, you do something, your reputation spreads. That's a persistent, permanent thing. If there is a quest going on in the world that you're engaged in, there's not going to be a repeat of that quest later on. This is another story I like to tell. I was playing a very popular, massively multiplayer online role-playing game many years ago. By the way, I'm just going to call it Morpegs from now on, and you can deal with the pronunciation. So, I was playing a popular Morpeg many years ago, and there was a landslide kind of environment. It was a snowy area of the map, and I was outside of this kind of an opening, a cave, and there was a woman standing out there, and she's losing her mind because her daughter was trapped inside of this landslide. Of course, there's a big opening there, so clearly it's not that hard to get out. But we went ahead, and I was like, all right, let's just suspend disbelief. It's an MMO. So I went in and I walked in, and I saw the child standing there, not sitting, but standing there. Okay, fine. And we had a conversation, and I was like, I'll take you out. I'm your hero. I will save you. And so I started escorting her out. Of course, these trolls and other things start to spawn because apparently they do that when you escort women out of, or little children out of caves. So I'm escorting this child out, and I'm feeling the sense of accomplishment, right? I've actually done something. I've completed my objective. I get out there, I deliver her to her mother, and then she immediately despawns when the next person walks up to her as I'm standing there, and off they go to save the child again. How trivial do you feel after you've spent so much time trying to solve a problem in the world, only to have somebody else come along and save it after you, right? That's a non-persistent world. The things that you did not persist. All right, that's what I'm talking about. Number 2, the human condition. When I talk about the human condition, I'm talking about 2 things. I'm talking about your attachments to the world around you and the recognition that your life, as you know it, is temporary, right? We all go through as humans the same experience and knowledge of our own inevitable end, right? We are born, we grow up, we grow old, and we die. And that's something that we face with every day, because that means that in our limited amount of time here, we have to do things meaningful with our lives. We question the value of the things that we do because we know we've only got a limited amount of time to achieve that end. At the same time, how many of you read fantasy or sci-fi literature? Raise your hand if you're a sci-fi literature fan. These are my people. All right, so if you read fantasy literature or sci-fi, then you're familiar with that experience where you get to the end of a book, and you've enjoyed reading about it, you've come to know the characters, you've come to know the plot line, and you kind of get that sense of sadness, right? Because the world that you had been a part of, the characters that you had gotten a chance to know, they're now severed from you. right? You're no longer a part of that world. And in many cases, you'd rather be a part of that world than your own, because it's exciting, it's interesting, it's new and different. All the things that you wish you could be in reality, you are in this world through the characters that you read about. And things like magic and infinite possibilities and relationships that just kind of work. Like all the things that we struggle with in reality are so much simpler in fantasy. So what we're trying to do with Chronicles of Elyria is to create or recreate a world where it's so compelling, it's so interesting, that you feel that same sense of loss when you log out every day, because you enjoy being a part of that world. Now, unlike a fantasy novel, it doesn't have to end there, right? You're not going to reach the last page of the book and have it end for the next 6 years, right? So, we're good. I didn't name the book. So, you know that, you can log in the next day and the story will continue. You get to continue to be a part of that life. But more than that, you get to help write that story. Which leads me to my next point, emergent storytelling. One of the other problems that we kind of summarized in the kind of past set of slides is this idea of emergent storytelling as a problem space. When you play most MMOs today, they have this idea that we all want the same exact experience, right? We all want to follow the same quest lines. We all want to experience the same story. We all want to be able to play one of the same classes that everybody else plays. How many of you really honestly, deep down, want the exact same experience as the person next door to you? Anybody? No, that's not how our lives work, right? Even people who have the same occupation, who went to the same college, who have the same skills, we all have our unique life experiences because that's what adds value to our life. We know that our story is different than the person next to us. So how do you ensure emergent storytelling in an online game if, as a design, we have to make sure that we deliver content to the players? Well, the answer is you let the players create the content. Instead of preventing the players from impacting one another, instead of preventing them from causing changes or impacting other players in any way, you instead embrace that. What if you were to go the opposite direction and found more ways for players to impact one another? So this leads me to the next slide, which is the most and least PvP in an MMORPG. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, how do you have a game which has both the most and least PvP in a game? Depends on how you define player versus player, right? So if I were to ask you what player versus player means today, you guys would probably think about swords and boards and magic spells and things like that allow you to do personal harm to a person nearby you. Well, that's a fairly narrow view of player versus player. If you broaden your idea of player versus player being just your ability to impact the world and experience of other people, then there are many other opportunities for player versus player, right? You've got economic, you've got social, you've got cultural, you've got all there's all kinds of ways that you can impact the experiences of another player. And because there's, for example, limited resources in the game, when you mine a node, for example, and it's gone, that's now something that's no longer available to other people. You have inherently impacted the way in which they're going to play because they no longer have access to that resource. That's an example of an economic way you can affect other people. If you move into a settlement to become the best blacksmith in the region, literally the best blacksmith in the region, everybody wants your business. The blacksmith that was there before you no longer has business. This is an idea of player versus player. So Chronicles of Elyria, which we're going to talk about more, has more ways to impact players than any other MMO to date. But at the same time, just like I can walk outside and potentially get assaulted or mugged, I go outside every day with the fundamental belief that that's not going to happen, right? Because it's such a rare occurrence in our world that we don't count on that eventuality. But in massively multiplayer online, in PAX, we've been trained that it's okay to solve problems by going around and hitting people with a sword, right? But that doesn't work in our world, and it shouldn't work in an online world. There are other ways to solve our problems. If you're playing a tabletop RPG, for example, your DM would probably be looking at you going to be more creative. Like there's other ways to solve this problem. So we've designed our games so that while open world PvP is possible, you can engage in combat anywhere. The cultural, the social, and legal systems discourage that highly. And that's one of those things that we have dials that will allow us to continue to make that less desirable as time goes on through alpha and beta testing, to the point where maybe about 15% of the population choose to engage in deviant behavior. Anything more than that, and people start to feel like they can't trust their world, that they're at too great a risk when they go out of their doors, and we don't want that. So those three kind of top high-level design goals, we felt like if we solved those, that would allow us to solve all the other problems. That's the process of distilling that's happened over the last several years. But from those three design goals, we set up with our 5 design pillars. And when I talk about pillars, I'm talking about the things that hold Chronicles of Elyria up. And anytime we talk about a mechanic or a feature area, we always go through this list of pillars and ask ourselves, does this design fit one of these pillars? Does it achieve an objective towards helping us maintain those 3 design goals? So let's take a look at these. All right, so here are the design pillars. I'm going to go through these again. We will dive into these in more depth with the individual feature areas. So for now, I'm going to take them from a high level. So the first is that the world has to be dynamic. And when I talk about a dynamic world, I mean that if something in the world can change, whether or not that's automatically over time, or specifically because the players did something, it probably should, right? Like if things change in our world, nothing remains the same. Similarly, when I talk about a world, I'm talking about it being dangerous, right? We want a dangerous world. This is where I like to give my little math analogy. If I were to go through this room and I were to give everybody a basic arithmetic test, addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, I would expect most of you to get an A. Maybe not everybody, but most of you. But the problem is that if I want to create a world that's really about the heroes in the world, you know, those true people who are unique amongst the others, I can't just give everybody a basic experience, right? I have to make it harder. If I were to go through here and give everybody a calculus test, I would get A's and B's and C's and probably much lower than that. You know, I don't think I'd get any zeros, but it might be close. And that's because our personal experiences, are the things that we've done in our lives, have conditioned us towards one path or another. So really our past experiences are what help us determine what our future is going to be. So if I wanted to make a game that had only 5 heroes in the world, right? How many of you played Final Fantasy like 14 or Final Fantasy 11? Anybody? I would hope so. All right, so how many of you played through the Black Mage quest, where you're the legendary Black Mage, you're the one Black Mage that's been resurfaced after the mages have disappeared for eons, right? How many of you realize that there were other Black Mages standing next to you? Right? You're not the one. I'm sorry. Sorry, Neo, you're not the one. But the reality is that in order to create a game where there is the one best, you either have to do one of two things. You either assert that there's only one, in which case the players are unhappy with that, because how do we decide what's the right way to make sure there's only one? Or you do the opposite. You let the players self-select, and you do that by making the game significantly more challenging, right? You give them a calculus test, the calculus test of MMORPGs. You're all going to walk out of here going, I hate math, I'm never playing that game. So the goal is to make it more challenging. One of the ways that we do that is this next design goal, which is it must be skillful, right? The game must be skill-based. If you haven't already, you should go over to our booth. We're near the arena, and we have our offline playable demo, or a subset of that right now, which allows you to do platforming and parkour and things like that. This is an example of what I mean. When a game is entirely skill-based from the perspective of a character, or character sheet, so to speak, then it makes it possible for people to, having spent enough time playing the game, to get so far ahead of everybody else that it's no longer competitive. But when you add an element of player skill, it becomes possible for players to enter into the game, a new game they've never been a part of, but through their previous patterning and the skills that they've attained in other games, they can immediately become competitive. Right? That adds value. It doesn't mean that it's always going to be there, but it does mean that even if you've been playing the game for a while and you're developing those skills, that there can always be somebody who's better than you. That's a lot like our world, right? I'm not going to go forward yet. Event-driven, that's the next one. So when I talk about an event-driven game, what I mean is like the conversation we had a moment ago about me signing off 6 months later, coming back on and having the NPC next to me. The problem with that is that means that I have no compelling reason to sign into the game. Right? The story is static. I'm not in any rush. What if you had your favorite show, and if you didn't watch it during a specific, what if we didn't have TiVo or Hulu or anything like that, right? You'd be in front of your TV every day at a specific time because that's the only time you can watch the show. But over the last 20 years, we've been conditioned to this idea that, well, if I can't catch it now, I'll just record it and watch it later. The moment you can't watch it now and you can record it later, the less important it is for you to be there at that moment engaged in the show, right? Because it's there for you whenever you need it. That's not necessarily a good thing, though. If the world is evolving, if it's adapting and changing, even while you're offline, you have a compelling reason to be there, to be a part of the story. And the last thing is realism. This is a tough one. It's often easily confused. One of the things we did with Chronicles of Elyria is we've added realism back into the game. And I like to say that's not using the restroom. Obviously, that's something we do in reality. But our goal is not to add realism for the sake of realism. It's to add realism for the purpose of dramatic storytelling. Right? Dramatic storytelling. Let's see. I think that this is talked about a little bit later, so I don't want to dive into it too much. But if I have to repeat it later, I'll just say I talked about it previously. One of the things with realism is if I were to... No. There's an explanation of this later on. I will hold off. But realism is really about making sure that in the world... That was my producer walking up, drinking a glass of water. I don't know if she was intentionally reminding me that I need to drink water or not, but it worked. So this concept of realism means that you have an opportunity through the introduction of survival mechanics and other things that make the game function more like our reality, that you have the opportunity for more dramatic storytelling. And I'll give you some examples as we start talking about the individual features. So this is a busy screen. Basically what this shows, I actually gave this screen to the folks at the Game Developers Conference last week as well. We're building an engine, a massively multiplayer online role-playing engine, on top. I've been conditioned not to use that because everyone goes, that's not how you pronounce it. We're building something called the Soulbound engine. And the Soulbound engine sits on top of a massively multiplayer online simulation engine called Spatial OS. And in the process of going through our 5 design pillars and our 3 kind of design fundamental goals, we've developed 40 or isolated 40 different feature areas and over 400 unique features. Most of these are things that have never been seen before in an MMORPG, and many of them are things you've seen before but never in this way. Over the remaining part of this talk, before I get to a Q&A at the end, because we started a little bit late, so I don't have my full time. Before we get to that brief Q&A, we're going to go through as many of these as we can that I had on the slide ahead of time. All right, a dynamic world. That was the first of those 5 design pillars. Remember I said it must be dynamic. Number 1, aging, dying, and souls. All right, I'm going to show you a video in just a second. But the idea here is that in order for you to become attached to your character, this is under the design pillar also of the human condition. In order for you to really get attached to your character, there has to be this fundamental belief that your character's time is valuable. So one of the things we did in Chronicles of Elyria is we introduced this concept of aging, dying, and permadeath. So you come into the game as a 15 or 13-year-old character, depending upon the path you take, and then over the next 1 year real-life time, your character is going to grow old and die. So you have exactly 1 year or less, depending upon how you play, to write your character's story. And it's not all on you. You know, this isn't necessarily just a sandbox game. There is a dynamic story engine that's behind you, a personal destiny for each character that helps determine the types of conflicts and things you're going to encounter. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But the idea here is that you have a finite amount of time to deliver as much to the story's lore as you can before that character dies. But that's not the end of your character. You know, when your character dies, you have something called a soul. We'll talk about that possibly later. But the idea is that when you die, you are able to reincarnate. You're able to bring your soul back, and through this process of birth, death, reincarnation, you're able to continue making progress while still being able for us to isolate the different roles you play inside of the story. I'm going to switch over real quick. For those of you who haven't seen some of our online videos on YouTube, I'm going to take this opportunity to show you some things. The first one I want to show here is just a quick video about our aging system, so you guys get an idea of what I talk about aging. So I don't think there's any audio on this one, so just ignore the logo. We have this on all of our audio, or all of our videos. But what you're going to see here very quickly is you're going to see a character who starts out looking, fairly healthy and such, and then over the course of the next 52 years, spread out, he's going to gradually become an older character. One thing I wanted to note is this is not just cosmetic. We want your play experiences to change over time. It's also going to get a little heavy here. So we want your play experience to change over time. So your ability to move around in the world, your ability to interact, your ability to jump and parkour and do all kinds of cool things, it becomes more and more difficult as you get older. But the things that require a more focused mind, a more reasoned and willful mind, those things get easier as you get older. And we also have a dimension of this called the social dimension, which I always like to make a joke about, because while your character becomes weaker as they get older and they become a little bit wiser as they get older, leadership is a rough one. We have 3 attributes related to the social elements. There's persuasion, intuition, and leadership. Persuasion goes down, because we all know you don't listen to your elders. Intuition goes up, because whether or not we listen to them, they know better. And then your leadership goes up as well, because with that age and wisdom comes experience, and we do look up to our elders, regardless of whether or not we actually follow their instructions or not. I'm going to be one of those elders sooner than most of you. So you have to see 2 things in that. One was the aging system. We talked a little bit about dying and souls and how that impacts your character. Now, Chronicles of Elyria does have permadeath, but permadeath is the death of the character, not death of the soul. So in a lot of games, when you die, there's a temporary penalty. Maybe you lose some experience, maybe you lose some gold, you got to prepare your equipment and stuff like that. But ultimately, you're able to continue going from there. Chronicles of Elyria has that same punishment, but instead of it happening each time you die, we accumulate those deaths, and then after your character runs out of lifetime, out of spirit, then we give you basically all that penalty at once. That's in the form of that character's permadeath. But you can continue playing, reincarnate, and then you quickly, as you play, go through the process of deja vu, remembering the things you did in your past lives, and very quickly you're able to get back to the point where you were before and continue on. So really only through that process of birth, death, reincarnation can you actually reach your character's maximum potential. The other thing we showed in that video was the body dynamic system. We saw the character getting heavier. In Chronicles of Elyria, character customization doesn't end with character selection and character creation. It actually begins once you enter the world. How you play is going to dictate what you look like. Also, you can see you've got this dirty shirt and it begins to snow. The snow accumulates on the ground. And they're not just cosmetic because each of those things have value to the game. When it snows, you can't farm. When you can't farm, you can't get food. So how do you go about finding food in the snow? You track the footsteps, right? That's how you find your prey in the snow. Still in this scene, whether or not I were to press walking forward, you can see the same outcome. And in some cases, I wish I had stood there standing still. But you'll notice on the left-hand side of the map and the right-hand side that the snow is accumulated. That's not something that we said, we want a snow zone, and every time you come here, there's going to be snow on the ground. This happens naturally due to the humidity and temperature in the region. You can barely make it out, but just behind the character, you can see his footprints. Those are persistent. Snow accumulated. Also make note, this is an early part of the snow system, so we're still working on materials and shaders. So unfortunately, it snowed in the middle of spring and the grass doesn't reflect that factor. Also would have been lovely if the cloaking got a little snow on it. We're working on it. I need to move quicker. All right, so one of the other features we have in this game are families. We talk about a dynamic world. In Chronicles of Elyria, the character creation process means you selecting a family that you want to join. And that happens automatically as part of a narrative. You figure out what was the occupation of your mother, what was the occupation of your father, what did you do as a child as you were growing up, and then it gives you the opportunity to choose different families of which to join. Those can be player-based, they can be NPC-based, they can be families that are looking for hardcore players that want to experience the most difficult parts of the world, or it can be a more casual group who's just looking for new players that want to learn how to play the game. And you can make sure that they're in the same time zone as you as well. But the important thing to note is the opposite is true. You get into the game, you find some nice person that you want to spend the rest of your virtual life with. You have children, and you either hold on to those children for yourself so that you can reincarnate and play them later. You give them to a friend so you can recruit your friends into your family, or you open that up for somebody else to play, and then they get the opportunity through that filter system to join your family. Now, the family system is important for a couple of reasons, one of which is the tutorialization, right? You come into a game, usually you go through the early starter zone where it leads you through a small set of quests so you learn how to play the game. Well, this happens in this game through actual play. Like your family teaches you how to play. Your family teaches you, how to do the trade of your family. They're the ones that teach you how to craft and do combat, how to build things and things like that. This is not by accident. We want that connection to begin at the very first time you log in. Reputation and fame. You join a family, what does that mean? Why would I care? Well, you care because your surname is their surname, and your reputation and fame in the world is tied to theirs. So they have an intrinsic motivation to try and help you be as successful as you possibly can, and to excommunicate you if that's not true. Like they don't want that connection if you're going to cause problems. But the important thing to note here is that you come into the world feeling like you're not just part of the world, but part of an entity that's smaller but more personal than that. So I went through that quick because I'm running out of time. Housing, the ability for you to create player housing. Now this is more than just having a place to store your stuff, though we do have limited inventory like we talked about a little bit earlier. Housing is important because what prevents you from just building a family of 20? Why couldn't I? If families are so cool, if having people in my family adds value to my game, why can't I just have families of 40 people? Well, the reality is that in this game, the size of your family is tied to the size of your noble house. Literally, your house. So the number of rooms you have, how large your house is determines how big your family can be. So only through attaining additional wealth, additional land, and additional resources can you actually grow that family. So you build a house on a parcel of land, that's great, but you're still kind of lonely and you want to go further in the game. So you invite some of your friends to come and play, and they buy parcels of lands around nearby you. You build 3 parcels of land, and you put a well in the middle, and you've got a hamlet now. And now you're collaborating as a settlement. You go ahead and add a tavern, you build out 3 times that many to 9 parcels of land and other buildings, and before you know it, your hamlet is now a village. You keep going and it becomes a town, and now you have a town council and you've promoted yourself to the position of mayor. Keep going beyond that and you can become a magistrate of an entire city. And if a kingdom were to settle inside your city, you'd be looking at having potentially thousands of players as subjects within your domain settlement. This is what settlement building is about. Land management, similar idea, but tangentially related. You buy a parcel of land, you decide that you want to let other people use that land. You want to recruit people to come build shops and housing and inns and things like that. You don't have to do it all yourself. This is where the massively multiplayer component comes from this. You can invite people from other settlements, other domains, regions, NPCs, and players to come and lease that land so that you can have a form of income and so that you can develop and build things on that land so that settlements can grow naturally. So this is one of my favorite slides. We don't have gliders in the game yet. So research and technology is all about communicating with the players, right? The maintenance cycles of most MMOs is about developing expansions, and for us it's not. For us it's about having communication with you, the players, and you do that through research. When you use the crafting system and slide over to the research component and start prompting, I would like to make this faster, I would like to make this stronger, I want to know how to make this cheaper, it communicates to us the types of things that you would like to learn about technology in the world. And there is a built-in tech tree that as you guys move forward, it tells us the direction to go so that the developers, as part of our maintenance and ongoing life cycle for the game, can put resources into that. So while there's no Da Vinci's flying machine now, if a server were to take the technology in that direction, then it would be something we would add at a future date. The world must be dangerous. This one we'll go through pretty quickly too. Animal behaviors in AI. Needs-based AI. So our ecology functions off of needs, and this is true whether I'm talking about PCs, NPCs, or animals. Basically, they're looking for food all the time. So you're not going to find animals wandering around inside a little cluster, inside of a level range that says this is level 1 to 10 creatures. What you're going to do is you're going to wander out into the wild, and if you happen to come across something that was wandering there at the same time as you, and they're strong enough and powerful enough to eat you, they will try, right? You're a food supply just like anybody else. And they're not alone. In many cases, they'll function in packs. So in this case, you've got a pack of canis rabbits, which translates roughly to wolf rabbits. Imagine a creature that was as large as a wolf, but had the ability to jump and run as fast as a rabbit. Yeah, that's scary, right? This is what we think about at night when we can't sleep. This is why we can't sleep. Monetization and ethics-based business. One of the things I want to talk about real quick is something you often hear about Chronicles of Elyria is that they have permadeath. This is true. But as we talked about before, it's permadeath tied directly to your character, not to your soul. But we also integrated our business model into the permadeath system. Now that sounds a little awkward at first, but let me explain. When we were looking at how we wanted to monetize this game, we didn't want to throw in a monetization system after the fact. We didn't want it to be a subscription or a microtransaction model that we just kind of added after we had a game and we're figuring out how we want to charge people, right? We don't like subscription because there's no value in that to us. We don't want to continue along in a business model where people continue to pay us for value they're not receiving. If you're not playing a game anymore, if you're not actively engaged in it, if you're not enjoying your time anymore, you shouldn't have to remember to cancel your credit card, right? It should just stop charging you because it should know whether or not you're playing anymore. Similar, microtransactions is not a bad business model, but it encourages the developers to focus their attention on the cosmetic items and things that they can actually monetize. I don't want our business to be about monetizing cosmetic items and sunglasses and cool hats. I want to monetize the experience that you guys have, the creative content you get to enjoy, the dungeons and all the fun stuff. That's how I want to be spending my development time. So we really like this idea of a buy-to-play model. Look at Guild Wars, something like that, where you buy it and you get to play it for as long as you want to. The problem with the buy-to-play model is that you need to establish enough content that players want to pay for more, which means that we're actually incentivized to hold on to new content as long as we can, up until the point where we feel like we've got enough that people are willing to pay for it. That is not what we want in a massively immersive, dynamic world, right? We can't make it dynamic if we're always holding on to new stuff. So what we needed to do is we needed to find a way to continue a buy-to-play model, while at the same time disassociating that from the introduction of new content. In order to do that, we had to think forward, we had to think differently, and at the same time, we had to think backwards. We had to think way backwards to the arcade, right? So in this system, you go ahead and buy a Spark of Life, which gives you the ability to create a life. That life lasts you approximately a year, depending upon how you play, and when your character grows old and died, you buy a new Spark of Life, and you reincarnate and you continue playing. It's that simple. There's no microtransactions, no subscription. As long as you're getting value, as long as you have a family, as long as you're enjoying the game, buy a new Spark of Life and do it again. Continue on with your dynasty. Yeah. The PvP in the Dance of Dynasties, we talked a little bit about PvP before. The Dance of Dynasties is something that's going on already. Come and talk to us at the booth if you want to find out about that. But there are kings and dukes and counts who are already kind of virtually playing this game, and it's really cool, the stuff that it makes. We've got some dukes in the audience, actually. A world requiring skill. If you've been to our booth, you already kind of know that we want it to be skill-based. Our combat is real-time, action-based combat. Crafting requires some user skill as well. Parkour and platforming is playable right now over inside of our booth. And then access restriction stuff is a little bit more interesting. I'll show you that one. So one of the things we've done with this game is we've added access restrictions, or what you can consider taboo areas. You know, if I were walking by a guardhouse back and forth over and over again, they'd probably be looking at me suspiciously. And if I were to stand into their personal bubble, they'd probably come over and whack me with something and tell me to get out, right? But that's not because it's illegal to be there, it's because it's taboo. I shouldn't be there, right? There's this idea of things that are socially acceptable, similar to standing in someone's doorway, you know, things like that. So access restrictions in Chronicles of Elyria is a different system that allows us to create areas inside of our houses, our property, and things like that, where we can actually prevent people from accessing them, not because it's illegal, but because it's not like socially acceptable. This allows us to do things like create online, or not online, but allow us to create merchant stores, you know, where we actually have our goods and things like that out for sale on a platform. People can come over, they can look at them, they can do things with them, but if they start to approach the door with those items, you're going to know about it, and they're going to find out very quickly that socially acceptable becomes illegal as soon as they leave the boundaries of your merchant store. Event-driven world. This is perhaps for me one of the most important things about this game. Our NPCs in this world, well, first of all, an event-driven world is one, like I said before, where things are constantly happening even when you're not online. You know, the sandbox and theme park games have one thing in common. You know, they're really two sides of the same coin. On one side, you've got a very strong narrative, you know, the theme park game. But like I mentioned before, the theme park is there regardless of whether you are, so you don't really have an incentive to be there. The sandbox game, there's hardly ever a narrative at all. And if there are, it's kind of secondary to the tools and things that you can play with in the sand. The problem is both of those are the same side of the coin because neither of them give you a reason to do those things, right? What if you had a narrative where the story was changing when you weren't there, and it wasn't guaranteed to always be the same? But what if you had a sandbox game where you had even more tools, and those tools were given to you a reason? And if you didn't use those tools, the world around you would change for better or worse, right? So now you've got something interesting. Now you have a moral imperative to be there to try and save the world. That's what we're talking about with an event-driven world. To make that happen, we need things changing while you're offline, and one of the ways we do that is with the NPC hierarchy of needs. We use the Big Five personality theory and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, like we talked about with the creatures before, they need food, they need money, they need shelter, and NPCs will constantly be going around trying to do those things. If their house burns down, they're going to try and find a way to get shelter, and maybe even forcing themselves into your shelter. You know, if they run out of food, they're going to try and find food, potentially even other players if necessary. You know, all these things exist in the world because the NPCs have needs. They also have personalities. Personalities in this case uses the Big Five personality theory: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And the idea is that every NPC in the world has some slider that identifies what their personality is. You go up and you're rude to one NPC and they might cower underneath your, you know, persuasion. On the other hand, you might walk up to an NPC and try the same thing and they're going to punch you in the face. You know, it's a different experience and you never know what that experience is going to be. You need to kind of warm up to the NPCs a little bit, get to know their personalities, because how you interact with them is persistent, remember. They're not going to forget how you've interacted with them in the past. And once you make a decision on how you interact with the NPC, that's going to determine going forward whether or not they choose to engage with you. And the last part on this is the Soulbound engine and destinies. I mentioned this before, but when you create your character, the Soulbound engine picks a personal destiny for you based on the alignment of the planets in the sky. Rather than a quest-based system where you move on from quest hub to quest hub, instead, your quests follow you. The way that works is with this dynamic Soulbound engine destiny system. And I'm going to give you an example because I find that's the best way to go ahead and do this. Let's say that in that story I told you at the very beginning that there was that landslide, right? So we were in the cave and it was something that kept repeating and things like that. Well, what if instead as a developer we stopped focusing on the pre-scripted narratives and instead made it possible for there to be landslides? Right? So now, I save that little girl from the landslide, I dig her out, you know, the whole village comes and they use the tunneling system to remove her from the snow. She's not going to respawn in there, but that doesn't mean there won't be like future landslides. So it's the same possibility for it to repeat itself, but it'll never be the exact same scenario again, and probably never in the exact same place. It's much like our world. There are 36 dramatic situations that we've identified in our lives. It was written about in the 1800s from a writer. In our world, we typically encounter 36 dramatic situations day after day, but the scenario and situations around them are so unique and so different that we don't recognize the pattern. Now, in Chronicles of Elyria, if we enabled the ability to do landslides, that's great, but that's pretty RNG, right? What if, at the time of your birth, you were predestined to save somebody from a landslide? What if we knew that was going to happen? What if the next time you went around somebody and somebody was in the snow, and you, having that destiny, actually caused by your very presence a landslide to occur and trap somebody? Okay? That's your destiny following you. So Chronicles of Elyria's quest system, the tasks and things like that, are built around the destinies of every single player interacting with one another and causing conflict and opportunities for storytelling amongst one another. Realism for dramatic storytelling. We have survival mechanics. We talk about that at our booth. We didn't jump on the survival bandwagon. We added survival mechanics because it gives us opportunity for dramatic storytelling. How many of you have read The Lord of the Rings? Or watched the movie? Come on, that should be the rest of you. All right. So how interesting would this be if in Lord of the Rings, Frodo woke up in the morning, he took the ring, he dropped it in a mailbox. An hour later, the mailbox was checked by somebody over in Mordor, a friend of his, who then pulls it out of the mailbox, takes it over the mountain, drops it in, end of story. Right? Much less interesting, right? The reason that could happen, yeah, right? Why didn't the eagle just fly them the entire way? So the reason that happens, and the reason the eagles didn't fly them the entire way, is because storytelling is about the journey, not the destination, right? It's all the encounters that happen along the way, and those encounters aren't possible if we automate gameplay. So we've removed those automations, and we've re-added things like hunger and thirst and fatigue, so that you have to stop and eat, so that you can be ambushed in your sleep by the things that are hunting you in the dark, and they are hunting you, whether you see them or not, right? That's what this is about. There's several other things here. I got the 5-minute warning. So I'm going to actually just kind of point you to the screen, let you guys know that we do have limited inventory. That forces people to have to carry wagons around or drive wagons around with them, which gives people an opportunity to determine whether or not they think a strong box might be in that wagon or not. Communication, we don't have a global chat. We do have global chat channels, but they function differently than they do in most games. When you're interacting with others in the world, it uses say, shout, whisper as your character. When you talk in chat channels, it talks from the perspective of you as you, the player. And so we differentiate whether or not something is in character or out of character, whether or not it's a conversation in the world or one of our global chat channels, which you can opt out of. It functions more like internet relay chat. How many have actually know anything about what I'm talking about? All right, so you can create your own channels, you can moderate your channels, you can add operators and things like that. Contract and economy. That is a topic all in itself, which I don't think I'm going to have time to talk about, but the idea is that we have contracts which create a system of trust between players so that you can, in fact, create a situation where a warrior comes to a blacksmith, the blacksmith goes to a gatherer, the gatherer goes to an explorer to find that rare resource, and then it works its way back up the chain so that not everybody has to be everything. They can actually specialize, and in a world with survival and the potential risk of death outside of settlement, the fact that you don't have any combat skills and your focus is entirely on being the best blacksmith you can be means you really don't want to go outside that settlement. It's dangerous out there, right? All right, there's other features like organizations and multiple identities. If you want to learn more about it, guys, come by our booth. We're over by the esports arena. We're along that back wall right there. Love to talk to you guys more about some of the things that make this game unique, but for now, I think I have to cut it off. This is where I go through all those individually. Oh yeah, more pegs of chocolate, real quick. How many of you like chocolate? How many of you like Hershey's? How many of you liked Hershey's when you were a kid? Right? Now, how many of you like dark artisan chocolates? How many of you liked those as a kid? No, right? Chronicles of Elyria is the MMORPG that you grow into, right? It's an artisan experience. It's not readily accessible. It's not easy to access. You have to find it, but it's infinitely richer. It's healthier. In general, it's a better chocolate, right? It's more mature. It's not going to be for everyone. Like, some people aren't going to like it right away. But, only by us taking the time to experiment, to develop new things, to mix up the ingredients a little bit, do we evolve from an area where we're no longer settling for the Hershey MMOs of the world. I mean, no disrespect to Hershey. Solely the accessibility. But, there's been a lot of duplication over the years, a lot of copying people's recipes. It's really time for us to try something new. Thank you guys for joining us.